the X Windows system. In this nugget, we're going to dig into the X Windows system, which is at the core of the graphical displays that Linux uses. First, we'll look at how to install and configure X Windows. Then we'll move on and discuss various window managers and desktop environments that are available for Linux, and we'll look at those window managers and desktop environments in action in SUSE and Red Hat Linux. Let's get to work. Let's start out this nugget with an overview of the X Windows system. So the X Windows architecture is composed of an X server and an X client. Let me draw a little picture for you. Here's our monitor, here's our keyboard in front of the monitor, and there's our tower here, okay? So the X server runs locally. So the X server is running on our local box right here. And the X server controls displaying stuff to our monitor. Now the X client, think of that as an application. And this application connects to the X server, then the X server displays information to our monitor that the application wants to. All right, so the X client here could be running on our local machine, or the X client could be running on some remote machine in the network. In either case, whether it's running remotely or whether it's running locally, the X client will connect to the X server and give the X server information, and then the X server in turn will display that information to our screen. All right, so this is one of the beauties of X Windows, is that we can have an X server running on our local machine, we can run some application, and it will display on our local machine just like it would if the X client was local or remote. It won't make any difference. It will display exactly the same way no matter where this client is located. Now this is nice for software that has really expensive licensing fees, like Mathematica has a really high per computer license fee. And so what you could do is install this very expensive software on one machine in your network, and then you can sit down at any other machine in your network and have the X client on that machine, have that application give the information to the X server and display it locally to your machine. And you're going to be sitting there using Mathematica, and it's going to be transparent to you whether Mathematica is installed on your machine or installed on some other machine in the network. Now the X server can control displaying stuff to your screen, like a window, for instance. But there's other layers to this whole X Windows system. And the next layer up in the hierarchy is the window manager. So the X server can display a window to your screen, but the window manager is going to add extra functionality to that window. So the window manager is going to give that window a minimize button, a close button, a resize button, things like that. All right, so the window manager is controlling the look and feel of that window on your desktop. And then the next layer up after the window manager is the desktop environment. And typically a desktop environment includes things like a control panel where we can change system settings. We can set network settings or change graphical stuff or change settings for other hardware on our system like a printer and peripherals and things like that. Okay, a desktop environment also contains a window manager as part of it. So the window manager and the desktop environment team up, and together they create the graphical user interface that we're used to when we sit down in front of a Linux computer nowadays. So the common desktop environments that are out there are things like KDE and GNOME are the two most common ones. KDE stands for the K desktop environment, and this stands for the GNU object model environment. And then there's different window managers that are out there. KWin is the default window manager for KDE. Sawfish is the default for GNOME. There's Afterstep and Enlightenment. There's TWM, which is an old-style window manager that we'll take a look at in this nugget. And we'll look at the window manager, TWM in particular, without a desktop environment in place, and you'll get a sense of what the window manager does, and then all the stuff that the desktop environment includes as well. And we'll look at each of these desktop environments in this nugget. All right, so now that we've talked about the basics of the X Windows system, let's talk about installing X Windows. The easiest way to install X Windows is during the Linux installation. So while you're installing Linux, you can choose to install X Windows, and you'll be asked a series of questions about what kind of monitor do you have, what's the video card in your system, that sort of stuff. However, if you did a Linux install, like a real bare bones basic Linux install, and then later you decide that you would like to install X Windows, you can install X Windows from packages like RPMs or Debian packages. And this is the easiest way after the fact to install X Windows on your system. Or you can install X Windows from source code. Now this is a little bit trickier just because X Windows is a really large system. All right, so if you're going to install it from source code, I suggest that you go out on the internet and you find some recipe, some step-by-step recipe on how to install X Windows from source code. And even if you're installing it from packages, all right, it's still best to get the package from the distribution CD, or if you didn't use CDs, from the distribution website for your particular distribution. And this is because each distribution of Linux tweaks things a little bit, okay? And so it's best to use the RPM or Debian package that is related to your particular Linux distribution. Now, one more thing I want to do before we go out to the Linux screen is talk about configuring X Windows. Now, there's a whole bunch of tools out there to configure X Windows, and it just depends on which distribution you have and which version of the distribution you have and so on. One of the tools that's out there is called Xfree86. Another one is called XF86 config. This is sort of a text-based tool, whereas Xfree86 is more graphical. Red Hat config Xfree86, Red Hat -config Xfree86. This is obviously a Red Hat specific tool, but it's again a graphical tool that you can use to configure X Windows. No matter which tool you use, what all of these tools do is ask you some questions, and you can either point and click or highlight some selection in the text-based tool, and then they in turn will alter the configuration file. Now the configuration file is in the etc directory. Sometimes it's in the etc x11 directory, okay? And then it's usually called XF86 config. Sometimes it's called XF86 config-4 to represent version 4 of X Windows. Okay, so it's in one of those places. It's in etc or XCX11, and it's called something like XF86 config. Inside of this configuration file is a series of sections. I've listed out some of them here: files, modules, input device, monitor, device, screen. And each of these sections has a format like this. Has the section keyword followed by double quotes and a name like monitor or device. Then it's got a whole bunch of commands specifying the configuration for that particular element. And then there's an end section tag that specifies the end of that particular section. And there are sections for each of these. There's a section like this for each of these items. Okay, sometimes there can be more than one section for an item, like a monitor. You can define multiple monitors or multiple devices, which have to do with video cards. And then the screen section is what ties the monitors to the particular video cards. Files is where you set font paths. Modules is where you can include modules for X Windows. Input device is where you specify the kind of keyboard you have and the kind of mouse you have and things like that. All right, so now let's move out to the Linux screen and look at how things are configured on our particular system and the tools that we have available to us in Red Hat and also SUSE Linux. All right, well, let's start here in Red Hat Linux with by looking at the man page for XF86 config. All right, this man page will have all the information for the configuration file. Let me hide this panel down here so we can see more of the man page at once. All right, in this configuration file, the first thing that's shown in this man page is all the different possibilities for the location and the name of the configuration file. Basically, it's in the etc directory. Sometimes it's in the x11 subdirectory, and it's called xf86 config or xf86 config-4 on most systems. But there are all these other possible locations and names for the file as well. On my particular system, on this Red Hat Linux system, it's called etc x11 xf86 config-4. All right, but sometimes it's just called etc xf86 config, like I wrote on the whiteboard, and so on. You just have to find it for your particular system. As we page down in this man page, you'll see all the different section names that are available or possible in the configuration file. We mentioned a few of these out on the whiteboard. Notice that you might see a section in the configuration file called keyboard or pointer. These are actually obsolete. They're still allowed for backwards compatibility, but nowadays they would be replaced by input devices, where you would specify both keyboard and mouse qualities, okay, parameters for the keyboard and the mouse. As we page down farther in the man page, you'll see a section of the man page for each section of the configuration file. So the file section. So this will tell you how to do things in the file section, like set a font path. Okay, as we page down further, you'll see things like for modules. So in modules, it tells you how to load a particular module into for use by X Windows. Okay, so this is where you come. You come to this man page when you need detailed information about the configuration file. Anytime you're going to edit that configuration file by hand, you should be consulting this man page because the formatting of the XF86 config file is a little bit particular. And it's that particularness that has driven people to create tools to modify the configuration files instead of you having to do it by hand. So if we quit out of here, we can look at one of these tools. One of the Red Hat specific tools is called Red Hat Config X386. If I hit enter there, you'll see a graphical tool will come up, and we'll be able to point and click and browse through lists and so on. For resolution and color depth, I can just choose from menus. For advanced features like choosing your monitor and the refresh rates, I can click configure and then go through and pick out the kind of monitor I have from a list. Same goes for video card. And then this tool will go ahead and alter the configuration file to reflect the changes that I made in this piece of software. Okay, I'm just going to click cancel here since I've already got X Windows working on my system. I don't want to go through and reconfigure it again or mess with it at all. Okay, so I'm just going to click cancel. Another tool that you have at your disposal is called X386. And if we look at the man page for that, that will show, this is how you set up X386, how you start X386 and give it a particular display. If we page down here, you'll see one of the options is called configure. So if I say X386 minus configure, that will allow me to configure X Windows for my particular system. All right, so that's why these tools were created, because the actual configuration file is a little bit particular. It's tedious to go through and set all these different options by hand. And so, go ahead and use one of the tools that are available to you to configure X Windows for your system. Well, now we're looking at a SUSE Linux screen, and in SUSE Linux, it's very similar to Red Hat in that they have graphical configuration tools, and you can get to those by going to System and then going down to YAST. The newer version of YAST is called YAST2. You have to have the root password in order to be able to run YAST because it configures all sorts of things. So if I click over here on hardware and then I click on graphics card and monitor, this is where I can configure information for X Windows. All right, so what's going to happen here is it's going to bring up some information about my current graphics card and monitor settings. But if I hadn't configured this yet, it would be probing my monitor and my graphics card to determine what the brand is, what the refresh rates of the monitor are, how much memory is on the video card, and that sort of thing. Okay, so now it comes up and here's the current settings for my particular system. All right, so you can make fun of my old monitor that I got at a garage sale for $1 if you want, but I'll make fun of you because you paid more than $1 for your monitor. Okay, so here's my Samsung SyncMaster 3NE, 640 by 480 is my resolution and 16-bit color depth. So if I wanted to change some setting there, either changing, maybe I'll get a new monitor one day, or maybe I want a higher resolution or more color or something like that, then I can click change and go ahead and change those things in a graphical setting by by pointing and clicking and typing stuff in like that. Then I can accept and finalize the configuration. All right, so I'm not going to change it because I have everything set up for my system, but this is how I would go about doing it. So I could go ahead and do all that, and then that would go ahead and alter my XF86 config file. All right, so let me bring up a shell window, which you get by clicking on the shell there in SUSE. All right. And if I go to the Etsy X11 directory, in that directory is the file called xf86config, no -4 in SUSE. All right. So it's Etsy X11 xf86config. I'm going to hit enter here. Notice right on the first page here, it says, please do not edit this file. In SUSE, they do not want you to edit this file by hand. And in all versions of Linux, like Red Hat Linux and the Fedora I think the next version of Fedora, they're going to make it so you do not have this xf86 config file able to be hand edited. They want it to be done through these configuration tools because so many people run into problems configuring this file by hand. All right. So use the tools. That's one lesson. And if there's something so specific that you can't find the tool that does it, then get on the news groups and ask people around, because you can't edit this file because it's automatically generated by our YAST tool, which just stands for yet another system tool or something like that. Or maybe it's a German acronym and that's just some urban legend that's what it stands for, because SUSE is actually a German distribution of Linux. Okay, but the same idea applies in all versions of Linux. There are these configuration tools out there that will alter this xf86 config file, and you should use those because they're just more robust, and you're not going to run into these formatting errors that you would run into if you were doing it by hand. Now let's talk for a couple minutes about starting X Windows. Forgive this display here. It's only overlapping and ugly because I have my resolution set so low for the videos. But what this is this is the GNOME Display Manager. And this is how X Windows is started typically, is from a display manager. You could start Linux up in text mode and then start X Windows from the command line, but the most common way to start X Windows is through a display manager. And this display manager is, like I said, is GDE, the GDM, the GNOME Display Manager, and that's tied to the GNOME desktop environment. But from this display manager, I can go and start a KDE session, for instance, okay, if I wanted to. All right, so the way that we do this is we type in our username, and then we hit enter, and then we type in our password, and then X Windows is starting. Not only is X Windows starting, but the GNOME desktop environment is starting, the window manager starting up, and all the various pieces of the desktop environment are starting, as you can see them come up here on the screen. All right, and then we get to our interface, our graphical user interface that we're used to for Red Hat Linux. Now for each display manager, whether you're using the GNOME Display Manager, the KDesktop Display Manager, or XDM, which is the X Display Manager, which is the most bare bones of all the display managers, there are configuration files and configuration tools for those display managers. All right, so here, if I just open up a terminal window, I can run a command for the GNOME Display Manager called GDM Setup, or GDM Config is another way to run this exact same program. And let me hide my panel again. And here is your graphical interface for configuring the GNOME Display Manager. So you can give information, like there's a little welcome string. You can specify, graphics for the background of the display manager. You can set security things like disallowing root to log in with GNOME Display Manager, or disallowing root to log in remotely with GNOME Display Manager. So these are good things to uncheck if you're worried about security on your system. Root users really shouldn't log into the system anyway by typing root and then a password. You should log in as a normal user and then use SU to change into the root user when you need to accomplish some root task, and then exit out of being root as soon as you're done. That just saves a lot of problems and hassles, and it's a good habit to get into anyway. So you could disallow these if you're worried about security. Okay, and this is the kind of things that you can set up in the GDM setup utility. All right. There's also a file out there if something's not included in the GDM setup utility in the Etsy directory, in the X11 subdirectory. There's a file called GDM in the GDM directory. There's a file called gdm.conf. And in there, it'll give you all the information and all the various settings that you can make to your GDM configuration file. Okay, so if you want to do something specific, this is the place to turn, is the configuration file. It'll tell you all about it. There's also an info page on GDM setup, and there's an info page on the GDM configuration file, so you can get information from there as well on and see what kinds of things you can do with the display manager. Let me just show you real quick how to alter your default display manager in SUSE Linux. So if we go to System, we're going to go to YAS2 again, and YAS does all sorts of stuff in SUSE. You'll see me using it all the time for configuring various things. Under here, we're going to go to System, and then under here, we're going to go to Editor for etc sysconfig files. All right, so you can go ahead and alter all sorts of things from this menu, and under desktop you can see the things that you can alter, like display manager. So let me click on display manager, and that's going to give me all the different choices I have for a display manager. Okay, if I want to change the greeting string, I can select that here, and then I can type in something here that will be the greeting string for the display manager. All right, I can alter my default window manager in the same way through YAST. All right. Now in Red Hat Linux, there's a script out there called Preferred Display Manager, and in the Preferred Display Manager script is where you alter what display manager you want to come up from the very beginning. But no matter what display manager you choose, you can still pick whichever desktop environment you want from there. Almost all display managers have a choice and saying, what session do you want to run? Do you want to run a KDE session or a GNOME session or something else? And so the display manager is really a small part of things, but it does start X Windows, and it does start the desktop environment. So it's important in that regard. But otherwise, it's really kind of like the forgotten link in the whole X Windows startup process on a day-to-day basis. All right, now I just want to show you what a window manager looks like without a desktop environment on top of it. All right, so this is the TWM window manager that I have running here on my SUSE machine. I don't have any desktop environment running. I just ran TWM. I started that up. I opened up a console window, and that's where I'm at right now. So I don't have any of those nice panels at the bottom. I don't have the graphical interfaces from those panels. I don't have the different workspaces that those panels provide. I don't have the icons over on the side for things like a trash can or whatever else is available to me on the desktop, things to open my floppy drive or my CD-ROM drive. I've got to do everything from the command line. Okay, if there's any graphical tool that I want to run, I can run it in this window manager, but I just have to type the command out on the command line. Then the tool will start, and then I can use the graphical nature of the tool to do something like configure my network or whatever. All right, so anything I want to run from the command line, I can. So I can do something like type xcalc. Okay, which is a calculator program. I put an ampersand after xcalc, and that will run xcalc in the background. All right, so I could go ahead and do some calculations on the calculator. All right, the little buttons on the windows up here, all they do is sort of iconify the window, make it smaller so that it doesn't get in my way. All right, this other one over here allows me to expand the window or change the size of the window. If I left click on the top bar, then I can move the window around. Okay, so that's the kinds of things that a window manager gives you. If I'm going to kill this window, the only way I can kill this window is by typing kill followed by the process number, like 6358. Okay, which you saw right here came up when I opened xcalc. So I do that, and now xcalc has been terminated. All right, and the window's gone. From this terminal window, I can also just open up another terminal window, xterm ampersand. Okay, and now I've got another terminal window going. You can kill a terminal window by typing exit in the window. So if you have control, like a terminal window, you actually can type things in there. I can type exit, and that will kill the terminal window that I just opened. All right, so this is the kinds of things that you can do with a window manager, but you can see all the things that are lacking from a desktop environment. So let's go to the Etsy X11 TWM directory, and in that directory is the system-wide TWMRC file. This is where you would alter the settings for TWM. Things like the color of the bars, the color of the background, the focus behavior of a thing. So all I have to do is mouse anywhere in this window and I can type. I don't have to click in the window. I just have to move my mouse into the window. And you can see when I move my mouse out of the window that the bar at the top changes color, or it changes shading. Right, so you can see I mouse in, it gets that little shading here, and then when I mouse out, that shading goes away. All right, so those kinds of things can be set in the TWMRC file. So this is the system-wide one. This is what everybody on the system will get if they run TWM. You can also have a local file in your home directory called .twmrc, and that will govern your own TWM session. All right, so there's the basics. That's what a window manager looks like without a desktop environment on top of it. Now let's go take a look at GNOME and KDE in more detail. All right, well now let's look at how to configure the K desktop environment. We're back in SUSE in a fully functioning K desktop environment setting. What I'm going to do is open up a shell window. Let me minimize this panel down here. And then I'm going to type K control, which is your KDE control center. All right, so my KDE control center here has information, has settings for all sorts of things. One of them is the desktop. All right, and in this desktop I can alter the appearance, like changing text color, changing font sizes. I can alter the behavior of the desktop. All right, so what does a click on the desktop do? Well, with the left button there's no action, but I could make it do something else. Okay, I could have a custom menu there, for instance, and I could set up what's in that custom menu. With the middle button on the desktop, I get a window list menu. With the right button, I get a desktop menu. All right, so this is telling you sort of how things are set up. Multiple desktops allows you to set up any number of workspaces or desktops on your system up to 16. You can name them all. Right now I only have 2 set up. If I want to set up more, I can use these little arrows up here to alter the number of desktops I have available to me. For panels, it tells you where the various panels on your system will be displayed, whether they should take up 100% of the screen or whether they should not expand as required to fit the contents. Okay, that sort of thing. There's the background screen image. You know, I can change that. Under taskbar, I can alter what goes on from the taskbar. Should I show windows from all desktops? What should happen? Group similar tasks when the taskbar is full, that sort of thing. And then finally here, window behavior. What's the focus behavior of the window? We were just talking about that with TWM. Do you have to click in the window to focus, or can the focus follow the mouse? So can I just slide the mouse into a window to focus on that window? And by focusing on the window, what that means is that I can type commands and they're going to show up in that particular window. All right. Under actions, I can do things like alter what my left, middle, and right button on my mouse do in the title bar and frame. So when I click a left button in the title bar, that raises the window, meaning it brings it to the front. If I click a middle button, that lowers the window, and so on. Okay, same for an inner window. If I click the left button on an inner window that's inactive, what does it do? Well, it activates the window, it raises the window, and it passes the click onto the window. So now when I start typing, all the stuff's going to come into that window again. All right, so these are all the kinds of things. You can see all the different kinds of things you can change. Size and orientation, I don't have the option to change because I don't have X server 4.3 or greater. All right, so I don't have the X resize and rotate extension, which I probably wouldn't use anyway, okay? So these are the kinds of things you can change from the KDE Control Center, and it's pretty much every aspect of the K desktop environment you can alter from within this control center. Now we're back in Red Hat Linux and we can talk about how to configure the GNOME desktop environment. In Red Hat, the way that you configure the GNOME desktop environment is you go through the Preferences menu under the main menu there, and you pick any one of a number of options. Let's go all the way down to the bottom to Windows and click on Windows. And this will allow us to alter Windows settings. Same things we were talking about with KDE and TWM. Do you want the window to be the focus in focus when I just mouse over the window, or should I have to click in the window? That sort of thing. Okay, so that's one of the things you can change. Go back to the Preferences menu. Another thing you can change is menus and toolbars. All right, so this has to do with toolbars in an application. Now let me pick another application here so we can see exactly what this is going to do. Let's go to Sound Recorder. All right, so in Sound Recorder, you can see the toolbar up here, all right, for a new file, to open a file, to record, and so on. All right, well, I can change this by saying, okay, let me just use icons only in menus and toolbars. And now back in Sound Recorder, I just have icons. I don't have the names below the icons. Similarly, I can just say, let me just do text only. And I go back over to here to Sound Recorder, and I only have text. I don't have icons. All right, so basically what this is doing is I'm making one setting in my preferences menu for menus and toolbars, and then there's all sorts of applications out there that will use this information for its particular display, so that you get this consistent display across all of your applications. Now, not every application has this sort of menu toolbar options, but the ones that do, this will govern it. Okay, and the point is so that you have this consistent theme across all of your different applications. All right, so I'm going to switch this back to text below icons. Notice also that they give you an idea here of what it looks like, so you don't have to have something open that has it so to see the results. You can just make your choice here, and it gives you a sample of what it would look like. All right, so that's the kinds of things that you can change through the Preferences menu. If there's something relating to the desktop environment that you want to change, the background, the screensaver, all sorts of things, you can change those things in the Preferences menu underneath the main Red Hat menu for the GNOME desktop environment in Red Hat. All right, well, it's time to wrap up our nugget on X Windows. In this nugget, we started talking about the X architecture by talking about X servers and X clients. Now remember that X server is running on the machine that your monitor is plugged into. All right, and the X client, or the application, can be running on your local machine or some other machine in the network. And no matter where it's running, the X client displays stuff to your screen through the X server that's running on your machine. Then we moved on and started talking about configuring X Windows. We talked about the XF86 config file. We also looked at all these tools that you can use to configure X Windows. And nearly every graphical distribution of Linux is going the way of not letting you manually alter the XF86 config file. And the reason for that is, historically, that's been a sticking point for people getting started with Linux and Unix, is that it's so complicated to edit that configuration file by hand. There's so many weird drivers and settings that you have to make that are cryptic, and so they've made these nice interfaces, and they're good enough now that all of your configuration of X Windows can be done through these graphical tools, and so that's probably what you should stick to. Then we went on and we talked about display managers, window managers, and desktop environments. Remember, display managers were the tool that lets you type your username and password, and then it started up X Windows for you and a particular desktop environment and got you going, starting your Linux session. Window Manager was the thing that we talked about, like TWM and some other window managers. We saw TWM in its real bare bones form on SUSE Linux, where you had just the ability to basically move the window around, iconify the window to make it kind of smaller, resize the window, but that was about all that you had available to you. And then we looked at the two most common desktop environments, GNOME and KDE, and in those desktop environments you saw all this extra functionality that we've been sort of used to from the first set of videos here. You know, and we had our menus available to us, our different workspaces, and all the different options on the windows that those desktop environments and their window managers provided. Well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks for watching.